Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, cowboys and Indians, that's what they used to say at the rodeo. We're here ready for Governance 102. Sheila will take over.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Great. Good morning.
Good morning.
If you remember last time, we talked about a lot about governance structure and roles and the trust. This one's a little bit more soft. It's a little more in the soft skills, the interpersonal, so there may be more questions. One of the challenges when I teach courses like this, that we talk about soft skills and we talk about conflict resolution, culture. Sometimes we want to have a tendency, and it may not happen here, but to use questions to state how you feel about a person or a situation. And I want to make sure that that doesn't happen, where it's, so if I had, what would you say if I had a situation that was, and you outline something with enough detail that everyone in the room can figure out what we're talking about? I'm going to ask you not to go to that level of detail. If you have a question, let's talk about it generically, how to address it. My goal today is really about learning, and it's about moving forward. In that regard, I heard this speech it was actually last week, and it got me thinking, and I want to read you part of it, and I'll tell you a story to kind of get us started here. It was a senior care fundraiser. And so she started, and she said her little prayer, and then she says, as long as I have the microphone, I have a few things to say. She said, first of all, I just want to introduce myself. Well, a little. Over the years, I've noticed two things that most people want to know about you. And those are the things that are far from polite to ask. So let's just get it out of the way. I'm 72 years old, and I weigh 145 pounds. As you know, we seniors are sometimes not very likable, let alone lovable. So Lord, could you please continue to help the people here be patient and aware of why we are here? And Lord, please remind them that the thing about old age is that you don't get a chance to practice. And the reality is, no matter where we are in our lives, we're always new at something. We're always learning something. For some of you, you may be new to this community. For some of you, you may be new to being a board member. For some of you, you're sitting on a board and it's changed and it's new, and there's new people with new personalities. There's new changes. You have a new managing agent. This is all new. And as I thought through newness, and I've kind of been reflecting on that and how do we adjust and accommodate during times, this is where those soft skills come into play. All of you sitting in this room are leaders in your community. Whether you like it or not, you're sitting in this room because you are a leader in this community. And leadership is not just marking off, rows in an Excel sheet. It's about the opportunity to work together to make your community a better place. And so today, as we're going through this, and it's a little less clinical and a little less legalese, and we talk about what it means to govern and how we handle conflict, this is an opportunity for us all to learn new skills, no matter where we're coming from. And I'm really excited about that, because every time I go through one of these classes, and I was just talking to Mike, I've been teaching this content for almost 15 years now, and I learn something new every time I go through it. Some of these slides I could go through in my sleep, and yet every time there's something new. So I'm excited to be here today. And this is an opportunity for us to learn, to dialogue, with me repeating into the microphone. And I'm excited to get started. So looking at today, really what the goals are. First, just kind of reviewing and understanding basic governance terms. What is governance? It's always changing. So we're going to just kind of review what that looks like to understand that. We're going to talk about business etiquette and business etiquette principles, and we're not going to call it business etiquette. It's really about conflict. It's really about how do we talk to one another? How do you show up for a meeting prepared? Recognizing the essentials of a positive board culture and mechanisms to build or create a positive governance culture. And then understanding the type of conflict and identifying strategies to successfully manage conflict. How many of you have had conflict in the last 24 hours? So a couple things just to review. I want to talk starting at the most pragmatic, basic level, reviewing a little bit about what governance responsibilities are, and really at the most basic business etiquette level, what does it look like to have good basic etiquette as a board member? So if you remember, we talked about this pretty extensively in the last class, so we won't go into as much detail. But the role of a director. First is fiduciary responsibility. Remember we talked about a second ago, leadership's not just marking out lines in a spreadsheet. That's not leadership, but that is governance. So there is an element to that. You have a fiduciary responsibility to the organization of which you are representing. There's also an element of legal oversight, and depending on the entity of which you are a part of, again, my caveat on not being a lawyer, and there are multiple organizations with different structure types, there is an element of legal oversight, as well as you are constrained and guided by laws we have, that are going to help guide you through that as well. And then the overall, and the emphasis there is the overall management of business decisions. I think in governance, and no matter what industry, what board, for-profit, profit, paid, not paid, one of the biggest challenges for boards are drawing that line between overall management of business decisions and managing. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, because when that line gets blurred, that's where a lot of conflict emerges. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about Davis Sterling as well, and these are some of the legal parameters you have. And this talks about the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. So you are responsible for your organization, for those who are bound by Davis Sterling. But you also have this loyalty to protect the fiduciary responsibilities as well as oversight. So there are parameters. These laws change every year. And there is a whole website where you can go and talk about it, your boards. I think there's going to be education on it. You talk through it. But there are a lot of models of governance outside of Davis Sterling. That's really the parameters legally. There are thousands of them. Last week when I was presenting, we presented like 15 of them. But one of them that's out there that is really one of the most generally accepted, kind of industry agnostic, is Carver's model of governance. And why this is so important is that Carver's model really defines parameters and sets expectations. And it took an operational model and shifted it so that way it assigned accountability where it needed to go. And it does it in a way that minimizes conflict and kind of makes it clear, this is your responsibility, this is mine. So if you look on the left, you kind of have Carver's model focuses on two very specific things, the ends and the means. So the means are really, what is the intended effect of decision making? And that is truly the board's responsibility. So what are the processes that need to be put into place? What are the checks and balances that need to be there in order for decisions to be made? On the other hand, you have the means, which is the actual results, the activities. So if you think about it this way, the board in good governance, you are dictating the results that you want. How it gets executed, the means of execution, the results, that's what you're outlining. What happens on the back end, which is how do we get there, that is the staff's job. That is your leader that you've appointed. When you talk about superintendent, in this case it would be your managing agent, the leader that's appointed to you, the CEO. It's their responsibility to figure out how to get this done. So an example of this would be, we want to not increase our association fees, or we're going to have to do it this much. This is what those parameters are. These are our goals. This is what we want to see happen as a board. We need to build a reserve. You need to have a decision, and you need to trust the staff and your leader that you appointed. And that's why Carver's model, it's all about constant communication with your leader and appointing and accountability, because they're executing on it. They're the ones participating in the activities that drive the results. There's also a lot of evaluation in there. There is board self-assessment, and we're going to talk a lot about this in a little bit. And there's also evaluation of the leaders that you appoint to be responsible. The thing about Carver's model is that there's accountability for all participants, whether you are in a role of governance, you are working as the managing agent in your case, or staff on there. And it's keeping those clear boundaries established. There's some great books on it. I actually think if you're interested in Carver's model, I think they have, if you go online, he's got a little quick notebook that condenses it down and gives you a high-level overview. I think it's under $15. But it's a fascinating model. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today comes back to this model. It comes back to accountability. It comes back to appropriate decision making, because those are the sources of conflict, and that's where we get into interpersonal trouble. And we're going to kind of talk about how we minimize that from happening and then what to do if it does happen. So at the most basic level of business etiquette is, how do we prepare for a board meeting? So some of these may seem really basic, but sometimes they get overlooked and they can lead to a ton of conflict. So the first thing is, if you are a board member and you're signing up, again, remember, this is being recorded for future participants as well. You're already locked and loaded into the seats. So if you're considering it, there is not just the board meetings. There's committee participation, which is vital to any organization. It doesn't matter. In good governance, there has to be committees, because not the whole board cannot make every single decision, or you will get nothing done. It'll be counterproductive. You won't move your organization, your community, where it needs to go. So committee participation is vital. Also, making sure you review the agenda in advance. So that way there's no blind spots. If there's something you don't know about, that you tend to get prepared for it. I always tell the story, my CEO of my firm, Jim, and I, we work closely on a lot of things, and he was a board member for the YMCA. He's been involved since he was a child, went to camp, grew up, and he's been on the board. So it was his first time. He was in the board, and the national board, and he sat in there, and he tells about, he was a young guy, and he came in, and they sent the agenda. So what did he do? And the young, ambitious, okay, I'm a Y kid, I'm gonna show them. So he goes ahead and he reviews the agenda and notices that they were talking about their long-term investments, the ROI. So doing his due diligence, he gets on his computer and he pulls up reports and finds out that the investment rate on the type that they had been investing in was 11%. Cool. Shows up to a meeting. Committee chair goes to present, says, hey, we're getting a return of investment, or it's 7%. Everyone okay with that? And everyone looks around and goes, sounds good to me. Jim raises his hand. Some of you have heard him and know Jim, so he has a way and goes, I don't know. I didn't know what I should expect, so I looked it up. It should be 11, 12%. It's what I'm seeing. Everyone was shocked. No, it's okay. Pulled it out. Here's the numbers. No one had done their due diligence and done their homework and reviewed the agenda in advance and came prepared. And so it was an eye-opener. Of course, everyone said, no, it's okay. We don't want to deal with that. 7% is good enough. But the idea is that, think about that, what you could do at that level. When you get to that level of an investment, that was not insignificant. So also reviewing documents relevant to the decisions on the agenda. This may mean going back to previous minutes. Remembering what happened. If you missed a meeting, making sure you've gotten informed on it. Looking at financial reports, looking at committee reports. You may have to vote, you know this, on a decision of which you are not a part of the committee. So it's not just coming up and letting them, we'll talk about what happens if you're in a board where the culture is, where, oh, we'll just let the committee decide and no one asks the hard questions. They did their homework. You don't need to get into the weeds with them, but you need to do your due diligence to review in advance. Also, management reports, any special reports or memos. I know this seems like a lot of work, but if you do these things in advance, your meetings become far more effective and actually a lot less conflict arises. Once you get into the meeting, there's typically a standard order of business that we can talk about this. There's parliamentary procedure, and each board is going to use this differently. I understand you're not required to necessarily use this, but I also have heard that sometimes there's confusion on how we can operate. If you get into a situation where you're just having a hard time communicating, this is a great mechanism to use because it's standardized, it provides clarity. This is when we're talking, this is who we're talking to, this is the decision we're making. So these are some, and you'll have these notes for yourself to reference, so we'll just go through them quickly, but some of the terms and approaches you can use. So in a sample, this is a sample order of business. Each board may do it differently. There's a call to order. The presiding officer is going to say, this meeting's come to order. I've sat through some of these here. You do this in most of the board meetings I've sat in. Roll call. Secretary is going to call the roll of the officers. This is to document, to make sure you know everyone is there. Reading and approval of the minutes. So the minutes from the last meeting are typically read, and if there are no corrections, they're approved as read. Officers' standing committees are called in the order they are listed on the agenda. and they're going to give their report. Some groups will put limitations, and you have X amount of time to present your report. Unfinished business and general orders. This is only if those exist. New business and announcements, and adjournment. A motion to adjourn is in order. You also have the challenge where you have residents who are going to come in some of these meetings and be speaking. So putting parameters on those as well can be helpful. So when it comes to the motions, there are actually different ways to move forward with this. So if you want to obtain and assign the floor, you typically need to stand up and address the chair and then be acknowledged. So it's not just standing up and saying, well, I'm talking now, so I'm moving forward. That is not how it works. The presiding officer is going to have to recognize you. If that were the case, we would get nothing done. So how to bring a motion before the assembly? The member needs to actually make a motion and somebody else needs to second it. Chair also needs to state it. This is really critical because it needs to become documented in your notes. Remember, notes from your meetings are actually discoverable legal documents. So it's important when you're documenting this that all of that information, but not every detail, needs to be in there. But motions, consideration of a motion. Members will debate. How this happens can vary from board to board. Typically, somebody is appointing. If you are in a situation where you're having conflict and people are talking over each other, set a time limit. Every person has 2 minutes, 4 minutes, however much time you need to state their case. No interrupting. And we'll talk about what happens when people don't follow those rules. Eventually, the chair is going to put the question and the members vote. There's also different types of motions. A main motion is bringing business in front of the assembly. A subsidiary is going to assist in treating or disposing of a main motion and sometimes others. So sometimes we realize, oh, we can't vote on this until we need to handle this issue first. Okay, I need to know what my budget is before I can decide if I'm going to approve on this. So you may change directions by using a subsidiary motion. A privileged motion is going to deal with special matters of immediate importance. It does not relate to pending business. So if something happens, you need to time out. We've got to address this immediately. A meteor falls out of the sky and lands right on the golf course, whatever it is. You need to address it right then and there. That's the time and place. And an incidental motion is related to parliamentary situation in a way that it must be decided on before business can proceed. So frequently we'll see this happen when maybe there's a situation, somebody's out of line, and you need to say, time out, we need to handle this. It's incidental. How are we going to handle this? There's conflict. I've actually seen physical altercations. Hopefully never here, but it's happened, and there needs to be an addressing of that situation and how to handle it before you continue on. And then the last thing we'll talk about, types of voting. Voice vote. This is the most typical. Do you agree? Yay or nay? A rising vote. Again, voting on motions. Frequently, it's a 2/3 vote for adoption. This varies from board to board. It may be dictated differently in each of your boards. Actually, I know it is. Show of hands, alternative to a voice vote, sometimes used on small boards, so just quickly, especially in a committee, who agrees? It's really quick, informal. A count, at some point in time, can be ordered by a majority vote for the assembly. Unanimous consent, that could be a vote of silent agreement. Does anyone disagree? Nobody disagrees? That's a unanimous consent. Everybody has acknowledged that they are ready to move forward. Or a ballot or roll call. Ballot or roll call. Parliamentary procedure, and at the most basic level, business etiquette and meeting preparation. So the question was unfinished business. If we don't finish a conversation and then we're going to come back, people will say it's new business. Is it new business that's carried or that's started, or is it old business? Typically, if it was something you said on the agenda we were going to take a vote on, and again, this varies. We like to think world is black and white, right? But there's a lot of gray in this. Typically, it's going to be if we did not take the action we needed to, because say we needed to get more information. So we need our committee to go research this further. It can be treated as unfinished business. In most cases, people will just add it as an agenda item and say, oh, we're putting this on here because we need to finish this conversation. So it really comes down to how it's documented. It's calling it an apple or an orange when really it's the same conversation needs to be had, but it's how it's presented on the agenda. Who's keeping track of unfinished business is the question. Typically, it should be your secretary taking notes on this throughout the meeting. That typically it should say, we did not come to, if you were going to take a vote on something, we were unable to come to a vote, committee. It depends how your secretary takes notes, but usually that's noted somewhere. I don't know how it is on each board because it's a little bit different who's actually recording and taking the notes. So that's something you should clarify with your board and make sure there's very clear understanding on who's responsible for that. So the question was, what about when a presiding officer gets off the agenda? I believe that that is something you should address up front if you're having problems with it. And how are we going to manage this? Typically, the agenda is there. What are your board's expectations on that? So you can go back to the agenda. Someone can point that out. But again, and we're going to talk about this, these proactive conversations in advance, what are your expectations? On a smaller, especially in a committee, you gave the example on a committee, correct? So in a committee meeting, that one's going to be less formal typically. So you have to, when you get together as a committee, sit down and discuss. When we build our agenda, what are we going to do? Is it okay to have a board member say, we're off the agenda? Some groups, especially in an informal group like a committee, are going to feel more comfortable being able to work that way. Some don't like it. And this typically leads to a lot of conflict. And to some people, it feels disrespectful. It feels rude. It feels disorganized, and they don't like that. It gets them feeling kerfuffled. In some boards, each committee, each board is going to have a different culture and different expectations. This is why the conversation up front about expectations is so critical. Okay, so the statement was, all of them with the exception of towers, say in Article 13, we will operate by Robert's Rules of Order, and those are not necessarily followed. Okay, so the question was, we are responsible to our community, and that we are, sometimes these are political decisions, and that how does that fit into this? We talked a lot about that at the last class. We talked a lot about what your role is. You are advocating for your community. You need to be mindful of how you're going to operate and govern as a culture, because that is showing up. Like I said when we started, you are leaders in your community. You have a really unique role as board directors here because you are directors, and I see a lot of times on boards where it's, oh, I'm a director, I'm on the board of this hospital, and you may not even live in the area, or it's for a not-profit you don't receive services from. You receive services from, are a part of, and are a board member all within the same community. That is a very unique dynamic, especially at the scale. You see it in HOAs, but you guys are bigger than an HOA. This isn't just about rules. This is your entire community. So you have a unique role that's different. And I think, personally and professionally, how you treat one another on the boards and the level of compassion and patience and empathy, which is actually critical. Those are some of the biggest skills in successful boards that do well. Those are the traits. They looked at the top 20% of performing boards. Those are the traits: innovation, compassion, empathy, listening. Business acumen was at the bottom of the list. That is how you serve your community, because you listen, you hear, you respond for the greater good of your community. So a board reaches a consensus in I believe you still have to take a formal vote for anything to be approved in a non-closed meeting, correct? So if you've reached a consensus, that's a nice to know, but it's not going to change the outcome of, if somebody comes at the next meeting and everyone's changed their mind on the official vote, that's different. And we can talk about what happens. If that's something that happens here frequently, where it's, we're agreeing to agree here, but then when it comes to the public viewing, we're not going to, that can be a problem. And we can talk about how to address that. So Davis Sterling, the statement was, and this is very true, it provides parameters. You can't add something surprisingly to an agenda at a large meeting. Committee meetings, I think it's a little bit more fluid depending on if it's a formal or informal committee. Committee meetings are also. So there are 4 different boards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 now operating here with very different rules, very different expectations, and different bylaws. If there are questions whether or not a committee meeting is considered legislative or not, check with your president, your secretary of your board, or if you're still confused, make sure you read your bylaws yourself, check with your legal counsel, because it is going to vary. I see this it depends on the industry, it depends on the board type, we see this frequently.